Now, how do I get rid of that box? Go. Okay.
There's a scrub jay in the yard, so they all ran.
Aw, cute. We got someone else coming in too.
Hey, Quinn.
Hello. Oh, here we go.
Hi, Milo.
Welcome, you guys. Letty, is there anybody else we're waiting for? Excuse me.
There were 3 or 4, but we can just get going and then can just hop in when and catch the recording.
Okay. Cool. Let's see. I'm trying to figure out the best way to move my little box of people here. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for inviting me today. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Jamie Pawellick, and I am a native bee biologist. And I specifically study bee taxonomy. So I know how to identify bees to the species level. So I am the person that puts a name on different bees that researchers collect. So I have been studying bees since 2000 and let's see, maybe 2005, I think. And I went to UC Berkeley and I worked for a professor there who, his name is Gordon Franke, and he has studied bees for his entire career. And he works in California and in Costa Rica. So when I was getting my bachelor's degree at UC Berkeley, I worked in his lab as an undergraduate research assistant. And when I graduated, he invited me to work for him full-time as his research assistant. So I did that for several years. And then I moved away to Florida, where I'm from, to be close to my family, and I continued working on bees there. But in Florida, we didn't have as many people studying bees. I was doing my bee collections. There was nobody to help me identify them. So I had to start teaching myself how to identify them. So I did that for several years back in Florida. And then I decided that I had to come back to California. So we moved back here and I started working in the lab again, but this time I work as their primary bee taxonomist. So when they go out in the field and collect bees for different projects, I'm the one that identifies them now. And I have studied with a lot of other professional bee taxonomists. One who used to work at UC Davis, but he passed away a couple years ago. And then I have studied with other bee taxonomists on the East Coast, and I did a 10-day bee class in Arizona, and that one was like bee camp. So every day we would learn about bees, we'd go out in the field and collect bees, and then we would bring them back to the lab and try to identify them. And that class was taught by all the top bee taxonomists in the country. So now I have been doing bee identification for, let's see, about 8 years now. And now I teach bee identification classes to other researchers. And mostly I do that here in California. Down at UC Santa Barbara, I have some collaborators down there that invite me, and we do weekend-long bee classes down there. So but I always love giving presentations and sharing my my bee expertise with anybody that is interested in learning. And hopefully you guys will get a little bit more insight into some of the bees that you might see in your own backyard. And if you guys have any questions at any time, you can either write it in the chat box, or you can just raise your hand and unmute your camera and, you know, just yell out a question. I don't care if you guys interrupt me, okay? Because I want you guys to get something out of this. Because if I just lecture at you, then you might say, oh, she skipped something that I really wanted to learn about. So feel free to interrupt me at any time, okay? So we'll get started here. Let's see. And hopefully everybody can see this well. So first thing when we talk about bees, we all know that the reason we have bees is because they do a service for us that's called pollination. And pollination is really just the art of contamination, because the bees don't actually know that they are pollinators. They don't really know that they're doing something that is benefiting us. They're going out and collecting the nectar and pollen because that's their food. But while they do that, some of the pollen sticks to the hairs that are all over their bodies. And then when they fly from one flower to another flower, some of the pollen grains fall off, and then they pollinate those flowers by transferring the pollen grains from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower. And then that's how we get seeds, and that's how the flower can reproduce and make a new flower the next year. Now, some other ways other than bees to do pollination is wind. So some pollen can just blow through the air and land on another flower and eat it. Some can fall into streams and be carried down in the water, but pollination is done by animals. And who are the animals that are doing this? So we know we're going to talk about bees, but butterflies are also great pollinators. Birds like hummingbirds can be pollinators. Even bats, because they have lots of hairs on their bodies and they pollinate a lot of tropical fruits. Then even beetles, flies, and wasps are all pollinators too. But really the best pollinators that we have are bees. They are the #1 pollinator in most of our ecosystems. These guys are built for pollination. So they have these special hairs on their bodies, and you can see in this picture what I like about oh, there's my doggy I told you guys about. Sorry. So this picture is of a carpenter bee. All right, Bandit. Sorry. So in this picture, you guys can see a carpenter bee, and she is entering the flower to get a sip of nectar. But when she does that, she's triggering the stamens to deposit pollen on her back. And so when she goes to another salvia flower, some of that pollen is going to rub off and transfer, and she is going to pollinate that flower. Now, some bees have hairs all over their bodies that pollen sticks to, and some of them just have pollen on their legs that it gets stuck to. And we'll talk more about that later. Now, why do we need bees? Raise your hand if you like apples. What if you guys like almonds, blueberries, pumpkins, squash, zucchini? All those things we have because we have bees. So this picture shows you what your produce selection at the grocery store looks like with bees in our ecosystems pollinating everything. Now the picture on the bottom is what our grocery store choices would look like if we didn't have bees. So a lot of those fruits and vegetables kind of drop away. So about 100 different crops in the US and Canada, so North America, we have because they're pollinated by bees. And scientists have calculated that every 3rd bite of food that you take is because we have bees pollinating our food. So next time you eat like an apple pie or you put some blueberries on your yogurt, you guys got to thank the bees for that. Now, I love this. This is a poster that came out a few years ago. Let's see, do we have did somebody type a question? Let's see. Ooh, here we go. How come the oranges do not go without bees? That's a good question. So the oranges are probably self-pollinating. So not all plants need a pollinator to transfer the pollen. Some plants can actually pollinate themselves. So they're called self-pollinating or self-fertile. So like your tomatoes. Did anybody grow tomatoes this year in their garden? Yeah. So even if a bee didn't come by, and it would normally be a bumblebee for the tomatoes, if a bumblebee just forgot to come by your tomatoes, you still got a tomato. And that's because the tomato flowers can pollinate themselves. But you typically get bigger fruits and vegetables with a higher seed set if bees are pollinating. And some plants require the transfer of pollen. So I mentioned almonds. If we didn't have honeybees pollinating our almond crops every year and bringing pollen from one tree to a different tree, we would have no almonds. Almonds have to get pollinated by bees. They cannot self-pollinate. So hopefully that answered that question. How much pollinating do mosquitoes do? Ooh. You know what? I don't know how much pollinating mosquitoes do. Mosquitoes are probably more going for, you know, mammals so that they can suck up some of their blood. And they probably don't visit, I don't know that they visit any flowers to get some nectar. So if they're not visiting flowers, they're probably not very effective pollinators. And I don't think mosquitoes have very hairy bodies, which bees do, which help the pollen to stick to them. Good question. So you can see in this picture on this, this poster, this was put out by Pollinator Partnership a few years ago, and they're based in San Francisco, and they're a nonprofit. They help educate people about the value of pollinators. And I like this one because they highlighted many of our fruits and vegetables that rely on bee pollination. So even things like alfalfa. So we don't really eat that much alfalfa, but cows do. And so cows need that alfalfa that gets pollinated by our bees in order to provide us with meat and dairy. Let's see, and other things like blueberries. So blueberries and tomatoes are really interesting because they need to get buzz pollinated. So the bees will actually hold on to the flowers and they vibrate their flight muscles like really fast. And that helps the pollen to get released from the inside of the flower. And then the bees can collect some of that pollen. So if you ever, like when I was growing up, my Nana, my grandma, she always told me when I was growing tomatoes to tap on the tomato cages because that would vibrate the flowers and simulate the action of a bee coming by and vibrating those flowers. So you could also take a tuning fork and hit your tomato cage, and that would vibrate the plant and vibrate the flowers so that the pollen would get released. And a really fun thing to do is look up a video on YouTube or online about buzz pollination. If you just look up buzz pollination, there's videos that show really close up bees buzzing the flowers, and then a cloud of pollen gets released from the flower. So if you guys get a chance later on, I would look up videos of buzz pollination. It's really cool. All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about bee diversity in the world. 20,000 species of bees living in the whole world. Did you guys know that? That's more than all of our mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians put together. There are just so many species of bees out there. And in North America, so in the US and Canada, we have 4,000 of those species that live right here. And in California, we're really, really lucky. We have 1,600 species that live right in our state. All right, I saw a little question pop up here. Let's see. All right, which kinds of bees do more pollinating, bumblebees or worker bees? Ooh, that's a good one. So bumblebees are a really interesting kind of bee because they are similar to honeybees because they are social. So bumblebees have a queen and workers and males, just like honeybee colonies. Honeybee colonies have a queen honeybee. They have drones, the workers, or they have the worker honeybees, and then they have drones, the males. So the worker bees are the ones that do most of the pollinating, and that's for honeybees and for bumblebees. The queens usually stay home in their colony and mostly get fed by the workers, and then they are the ones eggs. So the worker honeybees and the worker bumblebees do a lot of pollination, both of them. And the difference between them is honeybees are not native to North America. Did you guys know that honeybees came over with early European settlers? So all the honeybees that you guys see in your gardens, all the honey that we get that we put into our tea, all that comes from non-native honeybees. All the other kinds of bees that we have are native to this country. So bumblebees, carpenter bees, leafcutter bees, all the bees that I'm going to talk about today are considered our native bees or our wild bees. Okay, now honeybees are perennial. That means year after year, honeybee colonies last. So they can last many years versus a bumblebee colony can only last for 1 year. So that's just an annual colony, okay? So all the work of the queen starting her nest and all that, that just takes place in 1 year, and it's different from the honeybees, which can happen year round, okay? Hopefully that answered that question. I see another one popped up. I love this. Are honeybees an invasive species in North America? Ooh, that is a really good question. So you guys probably heard of invasive species, especially when we talk about plants. Some plants are growing here that shouldn't be growing here, and they're out competing our native species. And I actually would consider honeybees to be an invasive species here. That's not something that everybody would agree on necessarily, because honeybees are great. They are fantastic pollinators. We can put them in boxes and ship them around to different parts of the country. But there are thousands of individuals in one honeybee colony versus most of our native bees, which live by themselves. So they're solitary. So those thousands of honeybees in a colony are eating and consuming a lot of the resources in nature. So all the nectar and the pollen that's in the flowers. And so if they're eating it all up and sucking it up, there might not be enough for our native bees to use. Does that make sense, everybody? Raise your hand. Does that all make sense? Cool, cool. All right. Yeah, so they can be considered an invasive species. Most honeybees are kept in like a, they're managed by large beekeeper groups. And then there's hobby beekeepers. So some of you might have a honeybee colony in your backyard. But what happens is for the agricultural industry, and I'm actually about to mention that down here. Let's see. So in our lab, we recorded over 400 species of these 1,600 California bees in our urban gardens. But this is where I mentioned the agricultural industry. So farmers rely on just one species of bee, the honeybee. And like I mentioned, it's not even native here. So what do you guys think happened before the settlers came over and brought honeybees? How do you think that the fruits and vegetables and wildflowers were pollinated? Does anybody want to offer a guess? You can unmute yourself.
Maybe it was like bats in the other bees that are native.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we already had enough pollinators here, but
Yeah,
they
I was
didn't know that when they came over. So they started relying mostly on honeybees because we can put them in boxes and we can ship around to different areas of the country. But honeybees have a full lifestyle. So every year when the almonds bloom in California, which is January, February, all of the managed honeybee colonies in North America come to California. So millions and millions of hives come just for the almond crop, because in California we grow 90% of the world's almonds. So all the almonds that you guys are eating are grown right here in California. But like I said, we have to have bees to pollinate them. So some of our native bees don't come out in early enough in the year to pollinate those flowers. So that's why we bring the honeybees in. But the honeybees are then eating only nectar and pollen from almonds. And so they might get really bored of that. You know, think if you guys only ate bread every single day in, day out bread, you'd get really sick of it after a while. And you might even get sick because if you don't have a diverse, healthy diet, your immune system might get lowered. You might get sick more. So honeybees are starting to get sick because they don't have a very diverse diet. They're being shipped around from place to place, so they're kind of stressed out. And so some of the honeybees are having problems now. But we have kind of done this to ourselves because we changed the way we did agriculture. Before, we used to have small farms and people would grow stuff in their backyard, but now we have giant farms that take up millions of acres all across the country. And when they build these big farms, what happens to all the natural areas that used to live there? They just get mowed over, they get turned into farmland. So all the nooks and crannies, all the trees, all the bare ground, all the wildflower our native bees used to visit got turned into a farm. So they might not want to live there anymore. So now we have to rely on honeybees for the most part. But we have done some studies, and if we have farms that include flowers for native bees and restore certain parts of their farm to native habitat, the native bees come back in and they actually help pollinate our fruits and vegetables for us too. So doesn't have to just be the honeybees doing everything. All right, let me see if there was some more good questions coming up. Milo says, gasp, I know, isn't it crazy? And Quinn says, me and a friend did an article about bumblebees and I was wondering, do male bumblebees and female bumblebees look the same? That's a good question. So they pretty much do look exactly the same, except for there's a special area on the females on their hind leg, and we're going to talk about it, and that's where they store their pollen. So those are their corbiculas, and it's kind of like a little spoon shape on their back hind leg where they press and scoop and mash all their pollen. But male bumblebees don't really have to collect any nectar and pollen. They just have to feed themselves, so they don't have those structures on their hind legs. But pretty much in every way, they do look the same. Male bees have one extra antennal segment. So if you were able to capture a bee and look at it with like a microscope or a hand lens, and you could count each of the little antennal segments, you would see that the male bees have one extra segment. So good question. And then Jasper says, could we use native bees for agriculture on a large scale though? That is a great question. So far, we haven't really been able to use them on a very large scale. But some people are starting to rear bumblebee colonies for certain crops. So tomatoes and blueberries and a few other things. Bumblebees are better pollinators than honeybees. So remember I said that bumblebees can buzz pollinate? Honeybees can't. So honeybees cannot buzz our tomatoes or the blueberries, which need the buzzing. So some farmers are purchasing Bumblebee colonies, you can get it in a little box. And then when they can put them, the box of the bumblebees right in there like tomato hothouse. The bumblebees will go out and forage just from the tomato flowers. There's a few bees like the blue orchard bee. We also call it Bob, blue orchard bee, B-O-B. So this is a bee I'll talk about later on, and that bee likes to live in cavities. So, so those bees, we have figured out that we can trap them. If we drill holes in pieces of wood, they will nest inside there, and then we can take those nests and put them on farms, and then the bees will get released the next year and pollinate some of those crops. So it is something that we're working on for sure. Great question. All right, and then Quinn says, do bumblebees have stingers? And the answer is yes, yes they do. But only girl bees have stingers. Did you guys know that? Only girl bees have stingers? Does anybody have a guess of why that might be? What does a girl do that a boy can't do? Go ahead.
Because the girls are the workers and they do all the, like they go out and forage for pollen.
They do. They also lay
Take care of
eggs.
the, oh yeah.
So the queen lay eggs, but in the solitary wild bees, the female bees are the ones that lay the eggs, and that egg laying apparatus is the stinger. So girl bees can sting. Boy bees can't lay eggs, so they don't have that little apparatus, and so they can't sting us. So if you can tell the difference a boy and a girl bee, then you can hold a boy bee and you won't get stung. All right, hopefully it says my internet's unstable, but hopefully it'll hang in a second. Let's see. I think another question came in. Let's see, okay, yes. All right, let's continue on and see where we get to. These are amazing questions. All right, so I wanted to, Letty asked me if I could talk about this. So like why are studying bees important? So I wanted to get the point across that bees are seen as a keystone species. And so that means there are some organisms, some species in their environment that without them, if you took them out, the whole ecosystem would collapse. And bees are one of those groups of organisms. So say we're thinking about a California wildflower landscape and the different California poppies and Gilia and Clarkias and all the beautiful flowers that we see every spring. What if we erased bees from that landscape? Who would do the pollinating of those flowers? Maybe some butterflies, maybe some hummingbirds, maybe some of those other ones I mentioned earlier, but not at the same scale as the bees. So some of those plants might not be able to reproduce, especially if they are not self-pollinating. So those plants might be extinct. And so we might lose some plant diversity. And then when that happens, we might lose food diversity. So if some of our fruits and vegetables went extinct because we didn't have the right pollinators, there'd be less food for us to eat. But that could also happen to the animals in the ecosystem. So we were talking earlier about the little goldfinches right there in my garden eating all my sunflower seed heads. So if the bees weren't in my garden pollinating those sunflowers, then the sunflowers wouldn't make seeds that the finches could eat. And so what would the finches have to eat? They might have to try to eat something else, or then they might go extinct. So we might lose different organisms along the way if a keystone species was taken out of that environment. So bees are one of those, and they're super, super important. All right, I think another couple more questions came in. Let's see if I can get to those. Let's see here. I've been finding a lot of dead or dying bees around my neighborhood. Is this normal? And it is normal. It is sad to see, but the bees have a short lifespan. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but the male bees only live maybe 4 to 6 weeks as adults, when we see them fly. and female bees can live like maybe 6 to 8 weeks, a little bit longer. And so sometimes the bees that we're finding on the sidewalk or, you know, in our garden, they're just at the end of their lifetime. It's totally normal, but if you're seeing a lot of them, it could be because somebody's spraying pesticides in their garden or herbicides and some kind of insecticide that might poison and kill the bees. So that would definitely be something we wouldn't want. All right, Thomas says, how long have bees been around? Whew, millions and millions of years. So with some of the first flowering plants that evolved, I'm not sure how many millions of years ago, the bees started evolving at that same time. So they have been in, you know, in the record for millions and millions of years. And I can try to look it up and tell you an exact number, Thomas. Good question. And yes, Quinn, we got to save those bees. All right. So a little bit more, I am a bee taxonomist, like I said. So I classify bees into different groups and help identify what species we have. So researchers around the country are going out in cities, they're going out into agricultural areas, into wild areas, and they're collecting bees because we don't even have names for all those 20,000 bee species yet. Some of them are still undescribed. And so that's where I come in. So I look at the bees, I look at their morphological characters, which is their physical characteristics, like of their hairs, or the shape of the veins on their wings, or the texture of the pitting on their, you know, their exoskeleton. And then we classify the bees based on these different characteristics and we put them into different groups. And that's how we figure out what species we have. And in the US, there's about 10 people that do this on a regular basis. There are some people that kind of, you know, come and go and work on this for some of their projects, but they're not doing it as like a career. And most of them work at museums, and most of them are old men. So if anybody is interested, this is a great field to get into because most of the people are getting kind of old, and so there isn't that many young people doing it. And that's because a lot of the current research is going more towards studying DNA. And so you guys have probably heard about that, and that helps us to kind of put a name on something. But if you're out in the field and you are only able to take a DNA sample from that bee that's flying by to identify it, that would take a long time to do. You'd have to capture the bee and you might have to break a leg off and then send it to a lab somewhere. And then they'll send you some information in a few weeks. But then by that time, that bee is gone. So that's where people like me come in, and I can identify bees as they're flying, not necessarily to species, but I could tell you what kind of bee it is, usually to the genus level. And so that's like, if you guys think of like honeybees, remember on the screen earlier it said Apis mellifera. So Apis is the genus and mellifera is the species. Hopefully some of this is familiar. I'm not sure how far along you guys are in your signing, but if any of this is confusing, let me know. Okay, so let's see. Quinn says, will a bumblebee die if it stings you? Oh, such a good question. So the answer is no. And I know you guys have heard that when a honeybee dies, when a honeybee stings, it dies. And that is true. And that's because of where the honeybee stinger is attached to its body. When it, you know, if it stung us, it has like a hooked barb. And so when the bee tries to fly away, it rips off because the little hook stays in us. And then the bee tries to fly away. And so it actually pulls it out of its abdomen. And then the bee passes away. But all of our native bees can sting many, many times if they wanted to, but they don't because they're nice. And if you don't mess with the bees, then they won't mess with you. So good question. Clara says, have you ever named a species of bee? Not yet. I really, really want to though. That is one of my main career goals, is to work of bees that hasn't been well described or doesn't have keys for it. And if I do, I'm going to name it after my grandparents. Good question. All right, then Milo says, do you get to name a new species? If so, what are your favorite names that you have given a bee species? So yeah, so I would name it after my grandparents. And there's a lot of rules around naming things. You can't name a bee after yourself. That would be a big no-no. But you can name a bee after somebody else. You can name a bee after certain characteristics, like the coloration of the bee or the kind of flowers it likes. There's all different kinds of ways you could do it. So I really want to work on bees in the genus Megachile, and we'll talk about those. And that would be the genus, and then the species would probably be Texnanorum, because my grandparents are Nana and Tex. So I would do it Texnanorum. That would be my name, but it hasn't happened yet. Hopefully one day. All right, so are there any other bees who are different colors, like red or green bees? Yes, and I will show you guys pictures. There are both. And then how do you deal with the fact that species keep changing? We love our clean categories to put organism, but nature doesn't work that way. Sure doesn't. So it is challenging because names change all the time. People will work on a group of organisms and they'll do DNA analysis and they'll realize that the names we gave them before weren't necessarily correct. We maybe said things were two different species, but they were actually the same species. So mostly it's doing current literature reviews, and there are websites where you can type in a scientific name and it'll tell you if the name is valid or not. And if you're really into it, I'll tell you about that later on. Great questions. All right, let's see. Let's continue on here. Okay, so how I identify bees is I use a microscope. I have a high-powered microscope and the bees are on a pin. So after they collect them, the bees are killed and they will stick a pin through them so that we can hold them. And so I just hold the little pin and I move it around underneath the microscope and I zoom in on certain, so the bee on the top here, you can see it has big mandibles, and above its mandible is a little thing that swoops up, looks like a little shoehorn. And maybe when you look at the slideshow later, you'll be able to see some of these features a little bit more detailed. But seeing some of those weird little structures and looking at the different color hairs, that's how I identify all these little guys. So looking at their physical characteristics, you know, so saying like you have brown eyes and brown hair, same thing with the bees. This bee has white hairs and it's got, you know, different colors on its antenna or on its mandibles, different things like that. Okay, so how you guys would maybe start to identify bees is to get some kind of field guide. So the California Bees in Bloom's book is good. And then I also have this little field guide, and this one is the published one, and I can send you information on these later. And these are the ones I was going to share with you guys next week when I see you at the food bank. But this is like a little pocket field guide. And so in here has pictures of the bees and the flowers they like and little bits of information about them too. How I would recommend you guys work on identifying bees in your garden is to just go out into your garden when we have nice weather again and try to take pictures or try to take some videos of the bees that land on your flowers. And sometimes you can identify things just by a photo. But if you can't, then you can get like a little butterfly net, and you can collect a bee and put it into a jar with a lid on it with the help of an adult so that nobody gets stung. And then you can put it in your freezer for like 10 or 15 minutes. And that makes the bee cold. It doesn't kill them, it just makes them cold. But if you forget it in your freezer, it will pass away. So don't set a timer so that you don't kill the bee. And then, so take the bee out. You can just put the paper on your table and pour the bee out, and it'll slowly start to warm up and wake up. but in that few minutes of time, you can take a bunch of pictures of it. You can try to take a bunch of close-up pictures, and that way you can compare those pictures to some of the field guides and read the information, keep track of what time of year you collected that bee, because different bees come out at different times a year. And then look at what flowers you collected them on, and you can match things up to the bees in the field guides. And this book, California Bees in Blooms, that's a book that our lab put out, and it's an excellent resource, and it has some good identification stuff in there. Okay, so here is some close-up photos of some of the very common bees that you guys all probably have in your own gardens. So remember, somebody said, is there green bees? There sure is. Do you see the ultra green sweat bee up in the left-hand corner? Then we have a longhorn bee. That one's called Melisodes, and that's in the upper right-hand corner, and it has very long antennae. Then on the bottom right is a megachile. That's my favorite bee, and they're called leafcutter bees. And then the bottom left is Hyleus, or we call it masked bee, or a yellow-faced bee. They have little markings on their faces. All right, let's see. I think some questions came in. Let's see. Do you need to be a very organized person to be a taxonomist? Probably wouldn't hurt. I would say I'm a pretty organized person, and I like little details. So to me, being a taxonomist is being like someone that likes to solve puzzles. So when you're going through a key to figure out what the bee's name is, you're often reading a couple of choices. Does the bee have this, or does the bee have that? And you get to make a choice. And then when you pick that choice, you go to the next question. So to me, when I'm identifying bees, every bee is a puzzle that I get to solve. So if that sounds interesting, then you might be interested in learning more about being a taxonomist. And it could be for any kind of animal. It could be sea anemones, could be flowers, it could be anything. All right. Then Quinn says, do bees have mouths? If so, have you ever seen the inside of their mouth? Also, do bees have teeth? They surely do have mouths. They have very long tongues that we call proboscis. They also have teeth on their mandibles. So there's on the front of their face, see, they have these structures, and they open and close, and then the tongue comes out underneath that. And that's how they suck up the nectar and pollen. And so, yeah, I have seen inside there, and it's kind of like the bees have like a long straw that comes out of their mouth. All right, and then Arinthia says, are there citizen science that we can put our bee IDs on? Ooh, does the freezing work for other insects or bugs? I think the freezing does work for other insects. You might have to, if it's very small, I wouldn't leave it in the freezer for very long. I don't know about butterflies. That one I might have to ask somebody about. But I would think for the most of these, like these cold-blooded insects, if you get them cold, they kind of slow down. And yes, there are citizen science projects. There is a Bumblebee project where you can take pictures of bumblebees in your garden, and you can put them on Bumblebee Watch, and a Bumblebee taxonomist will identify it, and they'll put like a dot on the map. So, and there's another one called the Great Project with Gretchen Laboon. She's at San Francisco State. I think she still does this project, and she sends you sunflower seeds every year. You grow them, and then when they flower, you count and you talk about the different kinds of bees that go to the sunflowers, and then you enter your data online. Good question. All right, can you be a taxonomist for cat species? Of course you can. There's cougars and bobcats and all different kinds of cats other than house cats. So yes, you can be a cat taxonomist. And when we think we see a bee, how often is it really a fly that is a lookalike? Ooh, that's a good question. Quite often people get bees and flies confused. So here's a couple of differences. Bees have 2 sets of wings and flies only have 1. So if you counted on a bee, they would actually have 4 wings total, because there's a forewing and a hind wing, and bees have both of those, but flies only have 1 set of wings. So that's one main thing. And then flies have really tiny antennae that come off their face, and they have those big fly eyes. And if you had a microscope and you zoomed into the hairs on a bee has branched hairs like a stalk of wheat, but a fly has just 1 single straight hair with no branching on it. Good questions. Here's another slide of some beautiful bees. And just look at the bottom right-hand corner. That bee has purple pollen on its legs and yellow pollen on its back. So that means that bee was going to 2 different kinds of flowers and getting nectar and pollen, because it has 2 different colors of pollen on it. Pretty. All right, so some of this stuff some of this might be a little new, so I'll try to get through this. Let's see. Oh, another question. Let's see here. Let's see. Is there a kind of fly called the flower flip that looks like a bee? There is. There's
I
like.
didn't mean to say flip.
Oh, that's
I
okay. What
misspelled.
did you meant to say?
I said that there is a kind of bee called the flower fly that looks like a bee. It uses
Oh.
that to help protect from
Protect
predators.
themselves. Yeah, exactly.
I think it also pollinates.
Yeah,
but
totally.
the difference is that the wings stick out to the side in a V shape, not overlapping.
Yes, good job. That is totally correct. Yeah, so a lot of things try to look like bees because they know that, you know, some things don't want to get stung by a bee, so they're scared of it. So if they try to look like a bee, even if they don't have a stinger, their predators might think that they do, and so they might leave them alone. Okay, so one cool thing, most of the bees that I'm going to talk about are solitary. That means they live by themselves. They're not like honeybees. That female bee, she's basically her own queen. She gets all the nectar and pollen, and she builds her own nests. And most of her nests are underground. So they don't have like a hive or, you know, a big colony to go home to. They actually dig holes in the ground and nest under the soil. And most of our bees, they come out different times of year. So they have seasonal emergence patterns. So in the springtime, there's a whole group of bees that are like, yay, it's spring. All the ceanothus and manzanita and poppies are blooming. I'm going to come out now. And so they come out. And then they kind of go away when those flowers go away. And then in the summertime, when it's all the gum plant and the salvias and, you know, lavenders and things, there's a whole other group of bees that come out at that time of year and pollinate all those flowers. And then even another group of bees that come out in late summer and fall and work on those flowers. So different bees, different times of year. And bees really only care about 3 things. They care about getting pollen, they care about drinking nectar, and they care about mating. So that means bees don't really care about us. Has anybody been stung by a bee before? Are you guys scared to get stung by bees? No, yeah, it's scary. But really, bees don't care about us because we're huge. We're giants compared to a bee. So if they came and they saw us, they would just fly away. That's a bee's first line of defense, is just fly away. But sometimes we're walking barefoot in our garden and there's some clover that we didn't see, and the bee was pollinating that clover and it got scared when we stepped on it and it might have stung us. But really, bees don't really care about us in that way. All right, let's see if there was another question. Can I get to it? Nope, it's not letting me. Whoops. Let me go back here. Let me just talk about this and I'll try to, oh, here we go. All right. Oh, Milo, you're not scared? That's good. All right, so.
Also, I haven't been stung by a bee.
You haven't been stung by a bee? No? That's good. It's not very fun, but it's also not the worst thing in the world. Okay, so here's a little kind of drawing of a bee life cycle. So when we see bees, they're adults, okay? So there's no baby bees flying around. These are all adult, fully formed bees that we see. And that female bee mates almost immediately coming out of her nest. She finds a partner and they mate, and then the boys go off and try to find more partners to mate with. But the female, she says, all right, I got to start, you know, the next generation. So she starts building a nest, so digging in the ground or going into a cavity or something. And then she says, I got to feed my baby bees. So she gets nectar and pollen, which is their favorite food. And so she takes that nectar and pollen and she moistens it into a ball. So see that orange ball? That is all nectar and pollen. We call that a bee loaf or bee bread. And then she lays an egg on top of that. That egg hatches and becomes a larva. And then the larva eats that nectar and pollen, that bee bread that the mommy bee left for it. Then it pupates, and it either stays as a pupa for most of the year before turning into an adult right before it comes out the next year, or it can become an adult and just stay in the nest and overwinter as an adult, and then the next spring or summer come out as an adult. So that is the basic life cycle of a bee. Let's see. Ooh, Quinn says she stepped on a bee when she was younger. Yep, that happened to me too. And then what is that yellow thing under the larva? That is the nectar and pollen. So the egg, if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, so the egg is that little kind of like little grub looking thing, and it's sitting on the nectar and pollen. The orange is nectar and pollen. And then the picture on the very bottom, the egg basically hatches open and turns into a larva, okay? And then that larva is hungry, and the larva eats that nectar and pollen. And then it goes through some metamorphosis and becomes a pupa, okay? And then there's different stages. So probably you've learned a little bit about this with butterflies, so it's kind of similar to bees. Okay, let's see if there's more questions. Oh, bee bread. Yeah, bee bread, bee loaf. I like that name too. Okay, so a couple other things. Usually the boy bees come out of the nest first. So when the mommy bee is digging her nest, she lays all the females towards the back of the nest. And when she gets closer to the entrance, that's where she lays the boy bee eggs. And then they come out of the nest first because they're close to the entrance. They just dig themselves out. And that way, the boys are out and about before the females come out, because the females will mate with them like as soon as they come out of the nest. And that way they can just immediately get started on doing the nectar and pollen collection and building their nests. Okay, and then bumblebees, like I mentioned earlier, have colonies, but they're only for one season instead of many seasons. And we talked about how only the female bees can sting, right? And lastly here, we'll talk about 3 types of pollen collection. So if you look at the picture on the top, this bee has really hairy legs, and the hairs on the legs we call scopa. Okay, and when that bee is out collecting, she'll get pollen all over her, but she scrapes it with her legs and she grooms it onto those hind. It looks like she's wearing like a pair of leg warmers. Now the bee on the bottom right, that bee, if you look closely, it's not hairy at all. It looks actually like a little wasp. So since that bee doesn't have hairs, it actually ingests the pollen, it eats it, and it stores it internally in its crop. And when it gets to its nest, it regurgitates it, or it vomits the nectar and pollen up and provisions the nest that way. And then lastly, the bee on the bottom left, that one doesn't have hairy legs, but it has a hairy belly. So underneath the abdomen, it has a whole bunch of hairs, and then that's where she collects her pollen. So she'll kind of bump her butt up and down on the flower, and then the pollen sticks to it under there. All right, let's see if there's some questions. All right. How does the queen have control over the gender of the egg? Ooh, good question. So the female bee is so smart, she can decide to fertilize the egg or to leave it unfertilized. And so she fertilizes the egg. That means it's going to turn into a female bee. And if she leaves the egg unfertilized, then it will turn into a male bee. Okay? So she has complete control over this. She can make the decision to do that. Let's see. Does it harm the hive when people collect the honey and replace it with substitute food? It probably would, yeah, because if the honeybees don't have enough honey to last them through winter and we give them sugar water instead, that's not a very good substitute for honey, because honey is alive. It has lots of vitamins and minerals and nutrients that the honeybees live off of. And if we took all of it and just gave them sugar water, they'd have a really bad diet. So definitely don't want to be doing that. Let's see. How do you tell the difference between a bee, a wasp, and a fly? Ooh, good question. So bees are vegetarians. Does everybody know what that means? They only eat from flowers, so nectar and pollen. Wasps are carnivorous, and that means they eat meat, or they eat other insects, so caterpillars, spiders, even bees. And then flies, like I mentioned before, they only have that one set of wings. So bees and wasps are in the same family. So bees, ants, and wasps are all in the Hymenoptera category, but a fly is in a different, it's in the Diptera category. So they're even like in different families. Wasps have the same kinds of hairs that the flies do, the single hairs, and not the branched feathery hairs like the bees do. Good question. All right, I heard bees pass nectar and pollen from mouth to mouth to dehydrate it. Is that true? It is definitely true, but only for honeybees. So the honeybees, you know, they regurgitate it back and forth, and that helps to dry some of the extra moisture from the honey to condense it into that thick syrup honey, because nectar on flowers is very watery, and so they will regurgitate it back and forth to each other to dehydrate it. But our native bees don't do that, because our native bees don't make honey. Okay, let's see. Yes, bees definitely are smarter than us. I agree, Thomas. So should we give bees some of the honey we gather to the bees? I think we should definitely leave some of the honey in there for the bees, because bees make extra honey because they think, what if there's a drought? What if there's a fire? What if there's a crazy snowstorm? We have to have extra resources. So they stock up on their honey. Now, if we took all of it, we wouldn't have those extra reserves. So we should definitely leave a little bit to the honeybees so that they have enough to eat. And then Clara says, would wasps stay on flowers for prey? I have seen them doing that. I've seen them like landing on flowers and kind of crawling around and looking, you know, they'll kind of land and try to get some of the caterpillars that are on there. And I've seen them attack a bee that was visiting the flower as well. And I even heard them crunching on the bee. Good questions, you guys. All right, how are we doing for time? We already went an hour. How do you guys feel? I see thumbs up. Okay, see what I told you? I could really talk about this for a long time, you guys. And you have to tell me if you want to stop, okay? Okay, let's keep going. So some native bee nesting strategies. So I said these guys are solitary. That means they live by themselves. So they dig their little nest in the ground, or they find a cavity. So the picture here is a piece of bamboo that I was staking a tomato plant with. And this bee decided that the hole in the bamboo was perfect for building her nest. So most bees that are cavity nesting, they will just find natural holes in nature. So old beetle holes in wood, or hollow pithy plant stems. Like sometimes when you deadhead a plant or a flower, the end is hollow. And so the bees go inside there and make their nest. So 70% of our bees live by themselves, about 20% live in cavities, and then 10% are cuckoo bees. Has anybody heard of a cuckoo bird before? Yeah. So there are bees that are cuckoo bees, and those bees lay their eggs in the nest of a different bee, and then that bee raises that cuckoo bee's egg as her own. Who's got a question?
What's a cuckoo bird?
So a cuckoo bird is a bird that lays its egg in another bird's nest, because that bird is like, I don't want to do the work. I don't want to feed these guys. I don't want to build a nest. So they have developed a different strategy for survival. And so they just find another bird's nest and they lay their eggs in there. And then they let that other bird do the work of raising their baby. Isn't that cool? So there's some bees do the exact same thing. They just said, you know what? I don't think I want to build a nest. I'm not good at this. You know, there's just different niches, you know, that these animals want to fill. Let's see, I think there was a question, if I can get to it here. All right. We built a climbing wall in the backyard, and I sometimes see carpenter bees checking out the holes and then climbing holes one by one to see if they can nest there. Oh my gosh, that is so cute. Yeah, so carpenter bees like to nest in wood. So if there is like untreated wood around, they definitely will say, I wonder if I can, you know, dig a little nest in here. And the carpenter bees, it's actually the female bee, she uses her mandibles to dig and scrape the wood out. So sometimes they would use a hole that's already kind of pre-drilled a little bit, and then they'll continue on, but usually they can just build the hole all by themselves. So probably you won't have to worry about it, but don't be afraid of them. Just kind of let them buzz around, and if you don't mess with them, then they won't mess with you. That's so cute. All right, so we talked about our solitary bees. Then we have nesting aggregation. So like that's when like a whole bunch of bees found a really cool piece of habitat. So like think about like a condo. So a condo, or like a, you know, an apartment building might have a whole bunch of people living in one building, but they all have their own doors, you know, their own houses inside that building. And so the same with the bees. So they kind of just all found this really nice piece of habitat, but they all have their own holes that they dig in their own nest. Versus communal nesting, which is where they go in the same door, so the same hole, but then they diverge. One bee goes to the left, one bee goes down to the right, and then they build their nest down there. Now, carpenter bees are really cool. So remember I said that most of the female bees live just 6 to 8 weeks. Now, carpenter bee females can live 2 years. So they have a really long lifespan. That means that they can live long enough to see their daughters in the next generation born, and they will often share a nest together. Right. Okay, so in California, we have a bunch of different families of bees. So remember, we were talking about how we can classify bees into different groups. So these are the different groups that we have here in California. You don't need to memorize these names or learn them, but just understand that these bees live in different lifestyles and they have different features on their bodies, and we characterize them into these different families. Okay, so I'm going to talk about just a few common bees that you guys definitely see in your own gardens, okay? So who's seen a bumblebee before? Yeah, those are like the big, fuzzy, they're like yellow and black and sometimes have like white stripes on them. These guys are in the family Apidae, which is the same family as honeybees. And what's cool about them is on their back hind leg, they have this corbicula. So instead of having a very hairy back leg, they have like this little divot, like a spoon shape, that's surrounded by hairs all the outside of the spoon. And so when the bee is getting pollen, it's scraping it, it's putting it in that little basket, and then the hairs keep it inside the basket. And they typically will moisten the pollen with a little bit of nectar. And the picture of the bee nest, that was a bee nest that I got in Florida from a blueberry farmer. And he wanted to, he had them living on his blueberry farm. And then when at the end of the season, you know, all the bees pass away. And so he gave me the colony. And when I opened it up, that's what it looked like on the inside. So if you guys have ever seen like a honeybee colony, it looks much different, right? It has like those perfect like hexagonal, you know, structures with everything. But these ones are basically like little pots of honey. And so there's like nectar in some of them and pollen in some of them, and they lay eggs in some of them, and it's just very crazy and free form. And let's see, some of their favorite flowers are borage, comfrey, California poppies for sure, manzanita they love, lavender, and ceanothus. All right. Okay, so we talked about a little bit about carpenter bees. Those are the big black shiny bees. There's in that same family called Apidae. And the top picture is of a teddy bear bee. So remember you guys asked earlier if the male and female bumblebees look the same? Well, they mostly do, but some of the carpenter bees are different. So the female look is all black and shiny, but the male of this one species of the valley carpenter bee is all brown and golden and furry, and he looks like a flying teddy bear. And these bees mostly live in the really hot parts of California, although we've seen them like Sonoma, we've seen them in Sacramento, but I even saw some in San Francisco one time. So I think they are expanding their range of where they can live because it's getting warmer. And so now they can live in other places. Let's see, I think a question came in, if I can get my thing to go to it. It's not letting me right now, it will in a second. All right, so the females of the carpenter bees, they do all the nest excavation with their mandibles. So like their little structures on the front of their mouth. And we see these guys almost year round. They love salvias, they love passion flower vine, and like white sage, hummingbird sage, all those kinds of flowers, like fava beans they like too. Okay, I got to the questions. So Milo says, a few years ago in a very hot summer, we had bees that would be constantly in our lawn. Is this just because it's shadier or because it's damper? That's a good question. Was there flowers in the lawn, I wonder, that they were going to? No flowers in the lawn. Were they just walking around on the grass? Maybe. Yeah, that's weird. It could be, yeah, if it was very, very hot, then it's possible that they didn't have enough energy. Maybe the flowers weren't producing very much nectar. But that's kind of a mystery. All right, I just got a notification that I need to charge my computer battery, so I'll be right back and get my cord. Stay tuned.
This is fascinating. Hope you're all having as much fun as I am.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Oh, and Milo says they might have been wasps. Well, it's true. There could be wasps too. Sometimes it's very hard to tell the difference between flies or bees and wasps. And Quinn says, oh, a wasp nest in your house. Yeah, that's kind of scary, especially like the paper wasps that create those big structures.
It looked kind of like a hive. It was at my old house. It was on the outside though.
Cool.
Thankfully.
Like made out of mud or made out of paper?
I don't know. It
Yeah,
was
there's
pretty far up.
yeah, they make different kinds. Very cool. All right. So another bee in that same family is called Melisodes, or the Longhorn Bee. And these bees are out right now. So they're on my sunflowers and my cosmos. And you can see they're very hairy, kind of like a honeybee, about the size of a honeybee. And the females have the long hairs on their legs, so it looks like they're wearing chaps or like leg warmers. So they're super furry, but the males have really long antenna. And then, male bees have the extra in a segment, but on these, the segments are elongated. So it makes them look like they're wearing like a pair of horns on their head. So that's why we call them the Longhorn Bees. And these ones come out in the summer, but there's different longhorn bees that come out in the spring, but they're in a different genus called Eucera instead of Melisodes. But they're not as common. So these guys love cosmos, lavender, sunflowers, goldenrod, and gum plant. And the male bees, where do you guys think male bees sleep? Where does a boy bee go at the end of the day? Good question, huh? So these bees that live by themselves, they don't have a colony or like a hive or something to go home to. So the boy bees sleep on flowers at nighttime. The female bee, she can go to the nest that she's building and she can sleep in there, but she doesn't want the boy bees hanging out. So they sleep on flowers. So if you guys get up early in the morning, before it gets really warm out and you go and look on your flowers, you might see bees sleeping on them. And the ones that do it the most are these guys, these longhorn bees. And usually every summer I see them sleeping on my sunflowers and on my cosmos. And sometimes it can be like up to like a dozen of them on one flower head. So keep your eyes out, it definitely happens. All right, so these guys are in a different family altogether. So we're not in the honeybee family anymore, we're in the Andrenidae family. And these are like long, slender, skinny bees. They all look kind of different. Some are stripy, some are all black. But one thing that they all have in common is that the females have like a velvety patch of hair just on the insides of their eyes, which is usually hard to see unless you have a microscope. But these bees all come out in the early summer or the early spring, and they're out there pollinating like our poppies and ceanothus and all of the spring wildflowers. And these guys all nest underground. So remember I said different bees come out at different times of year, and so these are some of our springtime bees. All right, ooh, here's our ultra green sweat bee. And so this is a bee in a different family called the Kalidadi family. And these guys are called sweat bees because they will land on your skin, and if you're sweating, they'll actually lick up your perspiration, your sweat, because they're trying to get the salt. Yeah, Letty's like, what? This happened to me when I was in Arizona doing that 10-day like bee camp. I was out hiking around looking for bees. It's really hot out, so we all had shorts on, and then I felt like a little tickle behind my knee. And I looked down, and a little tiny sweat bee had landed on the back of my knee, and she must have been trying to get my sweat salt, and I squished her when I was walking, and so she stung me. But it was like the lightest sting you could ever feel, because the bees are like little teeny tiny. So that's why they're called sweat bees. These guys are active from spring through fall. So I've been seeing them since like March or April. And the males, I've been seeing a lot of them now. And they nest in the ground. And they like all different kinds of flowers, mostly flowers in the Asteraceae family. So think of a sunflower. You know how there's like little flowers in the center and then bigger flowers on the outside? So those flowers are great for bees because there's nectar and pollen in them. Okay, let's see. What color was it? Ooh, Milo, you have to remind me what we were talking about a few minutes ago. Let's see, why were the last bees called minor bees? Because they have ground nests? Yeah, exactly. They're called, sometimes we call them digger bees or we call them minor bees. And that's all because they dig their nests in the ground. And then Alice says, how many times have I been stung? Probably like 3 or 4 times, not very often, luckily. And usually it's my fault if I get stung. So I'll be collecting a bee in my net, and then I grab my net, and then the bee was right there, and I accidentally got stung. So usually it's my fault if I, not the bee's fault. All right, if the females mate right away, why do males hang around? So the males are constantly looking for a new partner, a new female to try to mate with. So even if they mated with a female and she says, I'm done, he still thinks maybe another female might come around. And so often what the boy bees do is they set up territories. So there's like a really nice patch of lavender in your garden, and the bees are just circling it, circling it, circling it. And they're looking for females that are going to come in and try to get some of the nectar from the flowers. And so they're just hoping that sometimes they'll come across a female bee that hasn't mated with yet. Good questions. Excuse me. All right, these are my favorite bees. These are the leafcutter bees. And these guys are different. They're in the Kalidadi family, and they're different because they collect pollen underneath their bellies. So instead of on their legs or eating it and ingesting it, they have their special hairs underneath their abdomen. So, and they're called leafcutter bees because they cut perfect pieces of leaf and they build their nest with it. So these guys usually nest in a cavity, so in like a bamboo piece or like a hole drilled in wood, and they go up to a leaf and they use their mandibles and like they cut them like a pair of scissors. So on their mandible are teeth, and in between the teeth is a cutting blade. So like a pair of scissors, literally. They can land on a leaf, chomp, 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 and cut like a circle or an oval in less than 10 seconds, really fast. And then they fly with it. You know, you can see the bee on the bottom, she has a leaf curled under her. So she'll fly back to her nest, and then the oval leaf pieces, she lines like wallpaper around her nest, sealing the nest up, protecting it from moisture so that it doesn't get moldy in there. And then the circular pieces are like a cap in between each cell. So she'll wallpaper the whole thing, she'll bring a whole bunch of nectar and pollen in, she'll lay an egg on it, and then she'll seal it with a piece of leaf, and then she'll move on to the next one, and the next one, and next. All right, another question here. Let's see, I know that sometimes taxonomists like to have some fun with scientific names, like the fish boop boops, or I think it's an isopod Han Solo. Ooh, are there any fun, funny bee scientific names that you can think of? I think bee taxonomists aren't that funny, but there is a new bee in New York City called Lasioglossum gotham. So if you guys are Batman fans, there is a Batman bee. That was an awesome question. If I get to name more than one bee, I think I will try to have fun with it also, because, you know, it's more fun that way. And they're more memorable. It's easy to remember the names when the names are a fun name. Cool. All right. Okay, here's our bob bee, our blue orchard bee. These are called Osmia, and the blue orchard bee is a species of Osmia, and they're in that same family, the Megachilidae family, because they collect all their pollen underneath their bellies, and they're like metallic blue, green, purple, black. They're all different colors, and these guys are active in the early spring, so like January, February, March, April is their time of year. And they're the ones that like the pre-made nest. So if you guys have seen a bee condo or heard of people making bee condos, these are the bees that would live in it, as well as the last bee, the leafcutter bee. And I took a picture. So last year in my garden, I had plant stems that were, I bundled them and hung them, and some of them nested in them. And so being the bee scientist that I am, I had to crack a few open to see what was inside. And when I did that, this is what I found. So the bright yellow, that's a whole bunch of pollen. And then you can see like a little piece that separates it. And then in the next cell, there's like a larva that has already eaten all the pollen in that cell. So that's like what the inside of a bee nest look like. Pretty cool. Oh, Milo has a bee nest. Oh, cool. I bet you have lots of bees living in there. Let's see. So their favorite flowers, they love Oregon grape, they love calendula, or dandelions, blackberries, raspberries, but also almonds, apples, cherries, plums, all of our orchard trees they like to visit as well. They're very, very important pollinators. All right, and I think we're getting close to the end of the bees here. So this is in a different family. This is called Kalidadi, and this is that yellow-faced bee. So you can see it's all black, and it has like yellow stripes on the front of its face. And then, so the picture on the top is a girl, and then one on the bottom is a boy, and the boys have much more coloration going on their faces. And they're really small. So like think about the size of a grain of rice. That's how big these bees are, or smaller. So these guys are the ones, they don't have very many hairs on their bodies, so they ingest the pollen. And there's a lady that sends me pictures of bees to identify, and she has pictures of these bees, and they blow spit bubbles. And they are doing what the honeybees doing, trying to dry off some of the nectar to condense it a little bit. So she blows a little spit bubble over and over, and it's the nectar that she collected from the flowers, and she's trying to dry off a little bit of the water, the extra water that's in it. So they like yarrow, buckwheat, and goldenrod, but many other flowers as well. All right, are there animals in North America that specialize in eating bees? I'm not sure if there's any that specifically specialize, but there are, you know, there's birds. I have seen birds hunting bees in gardens before. Definitely spiders can catch bees on flowers, and wasps. Yeah, they definitely are tough. But yeah, so they do have predators for sure. Okay, so this last part, I'll probably go through a little bit more quickly, and then you guys can kind of go this a little bit more in depth later on, but this is like the more like gardening part. But looks like you guys maybe have some of these things. So in the center, you'll see a picture. That's like a little bee condo that somebody made. And it has a whole bunch of different pieces of bamboo and pieces of wood that they drilled holes in. And then the other pictures are my garden. I have like a bird bath in my garden. And I also have, my front yard is all native plants, because that's what the native bees like. So if you're gonna do like a wildlife garden or a butterfly garden or a bird garden or a bee garden, you have to provide food, water, and a place to raise young. So nesting, habitat, and resources. So this is my backyard in springtime this year. So I grow a lot of Phacelia tanacetufolia, which is the purple flower. It's called tansy leaf Phacelia. It's a native California plant, and it's an annual, so it comes back every year. And I let it reseed every year. And then you can see California poppies, you can see some fruit trees, and my bird bath. And so I mostly focus on bees, but because I have all these flowers, I see tons of hummingbirds, tons of butterflies. I've got monarchs going through my garden now. I've got Gulf fritillaries going through my garden, and then tons of birds also. So if you're gonna plant a garden for bees, it has to be full of flowers because food for bees is flowers, and native plants are best. And that's because native bees and native plants co-evolved for thousands and thousands of years. So they're like pre-programmed to want to visit native plants. And native plants are great because they do well here because they already know our soil, they already know our weather, you know, they're just adapted to living in California. So the plants are easy to grow. You don't usually have to use a lot of fertilizer or pesticides or anything like that. So native plants are always best, but there are some non-natives that bees like as well. And you can, like, if you're like researching plants, you could like research by the plant family. So like I said, sunflowers have nectar and pollen in their flowers versus like a lavender, which mostly has just nectar for the bees. So I always say a combination of all different kinds of flowers because some bees have long tongues and some bees have short tongues. So the types of flowers that they visit are based on their own like body shapes. So if we have a whole bunch of different kinds of flowers, then we'll have more different kinds of bees. So, and then you also have to think about this bee seasons. So remember we said there's early spring bees and summer bees and fall bees. So we have to make sure our gardens are flowering all year long. So in the spring, this is what my garden looks like. It has all different kinds of flowers. And then in the summer, it switches. There's different flowers that come into bloom. And even now I have much different flowers. I've got sunflowers, goldenrod, asters, buckwheats, things like that. Good tip if you're gonna do your bee garden is to put flowers in patches. So having all of your California poppies together in one place, all of your lilac together, all of your ceanothus, and that way it makes the bees have an easier time to find what they're looking for. So when bees go out searching for flowers, they like to just go to the same thing over and over again because it's easier to find. So if they say, okay, I just want a whole bunch of pollen, I'm gonna go to California poppies. But if you poppies planted far away from each other, then the bees have to spend more time finding them. So if you put them all together, it cuts down on the time that the bees have to search for things. And then it's easier for you to watch your bees also. And then you have to obviously take care of your flowers. You can't just plant it and walk away. Water them. Sometimes you got to fertilize them or give them compost. And then you should deadhead your flowers. And that means when the flower starts to droop and kind of be finished, if you cut it off, the plant says, oh no, I didn't get to reproduce. I'll make another flower. And so it'll continuously bloom for a much longer time. And then the bees have more food to eat as well. Let's see, I think there was some questions. Let's see. Isn't there a bird called a bee eater? Yes, you're right. I don't remember where they live though, so we'd have to look that up. And then let's see. Okay, there's a little thing about mosquitoes. I'll have to read that later. Thank you. All right, so next here. Okay, so that was food. Now your bees need to drink some water. So honeybees need water in order to survive, but our native bees get enough water from the nectar in the flowers because like really watery. So they get enough water that way, but honeybees, since there's so many of them in a colony, they need extra water. So I have my bird bath and I'll actually put rocks in the bird bath on the edges so that when the bee lands on it, it can just land on the rock and walk to the edge and sip up the water that way so it doesn't accidentally fall in and drown. You could also float a piece of cork on the top of your bird bath and the bees can land on that too. And then our mason bees, like the bob bee that I was talking about earlier, they need mud in order to build their nest. And if you don't have just a muddy patch in your garden, the bees will sip up some of that water and they will mix it with the dirt to make their own mud. And then they'll use that mud to seal up their nest. So you can see at the end of these nests at the bottom, there's a piece of mud plugging the nest. And so the bee uses that That's why they call them a mason bee. All right, so mulching, really good for your garden because it helps keep the weeds down and conserve moisture in the soil. But remember, some of these bees are teeny tiny and they nest in the ground. So what if there's like this much mulch, you know, above your soil? Then the bees might not be able to dig down. So we always tell people to leave some part of your garden mulch free so that the bees have direct access to the ground so that they can dig their nests in there. And then the picture on the right, that is a leaf that a leaf cutter bee cut a bunch of pieces from. And you guys might have seen this if anybody has roses in their garden or red buds, and you see these perfect little circles cut on the leaf, then you know it's from a leaf cutter bee. And the picture on the very bottom is like one little cell from a leaf cutter bee nest. And so you can see the egg laid on top of the nectar and pollen. I just think they're really cool. And if you want to build your own bee condo, you can definitely do that. So you would just take like a big chunk of wood, like a 4x4 or bigger, and with the help of an adult, you can drill holes, different sizes, from 3/16 of an inch to 5/16 of an inch. And you don't want to drill all the way through. You want there to be the back of the nest. You know, you want one end closed and one end open so the bees can fly in. And then you can build a roof on it, or you can hang it under a roof, you know, somewhere in your garden that has protection from the rain, because if they got wet inside, they could get moldy. So we don't want to say, hey, bees, come live in my house, but then I forget to protect them from the rain. And you also want to protect them from extreme heat. So hanging them somewhere in your garden that gets morning sun and afternoon shade is best, so that the bees don't cook inside, okay? All right, let's see. Do they compete with spiders for the holes? Oh, that's a good question. I definitely see wasps and spiders using some of the holes. So yeah, they can definitely, you know, share the resources, but usually we're trying to leave the holes for the bees. George says, does elevation off the ground matter for the condos? It doesn't really matter. Bees can go really, really high, or they can, you know, be pretty low. So I would just say somewhere where they, you know, get the protection that they need and the sun direction, you know, the morning sun, afternoon shade. But, you know, height off of the ground, that part doesn't matter. You can also get paper straws to put inside the holes. Because if you build a whole bunch of bee condos in your garden and you attract all these bees to nest in them, you're also going to get some of the pests with that. So mites and some diseases can start to break out in the big colonies. So you got to clean your bee condo out. And so the best way to do that is to line the holes with these paper straws, and then, you know, you'll put them in there, the bee will come in, make a nest, plug it off, then the next year you'll see the hole where the bee left, then you'll wait like a couple of weeks for everybody to get out, you'll take the little straw out, and then you'll put a new one back in, okay? So you've got to keep it clean so that pests don't build up. What I do is I just have a few holes drilled in random places in my garden. I don't have like one big structure. That way I don't group too many of them together in one place. You can certainly buy them online too. I have seen them sold online. Okay, so this I will just mention, we don't want to use any pesticides, insecticides, or herbicides in the garden, because in addition to killing the bad things, you're going to kill the good things too, unfortunately. Even some of the plants that get sprayed with things can poison the nectar and the pollen in the plant. And then the bee eats the nectar and pollen and feeds it to the babies, and then they might die. So organic practices in the garden are best when we're trying to help out our pollinators. So make sure you're buying plants from reputable sources and ask the nurseries and the growers if they're organic and how they were treated and that kind of thing. Okay, at the very end, how do you know if it worked? How do you know if your garden worked? Well, you got to get out there and observe. So this is the best part. This is when you get to go out to your garden and look and see what you find. And all the pictures here are pictures that I took with my own camera. And so on the bottom left is the sleeping bees. So I think there's like about 13 or so bees in that picture, and they're sleeping on a little cosmos flower. And then I saw a bumblebee coming out of a penstemon one time. So you just see a little bee butt coming out of a flower. And then my favorite leafcutter bees on that Gaillardia oranges and lemons. And it's fun watching them because they kind of bump their butts up and down on the flower to get all that nectar and pollen. So the best way to know if your garden works is to just go out there and look and just kind of sit in front of it and then take pictures and take notes and see what are their favorite plants, what are they doing, what kind of behaviors can you observe. And it's different at different times a year, so you got to do this many, many times. All right, so some of our lessons, we know that bees in gardens are awesome because we get bigger, better fruits and vegetables. They also pollinate all of our wildland flowers. And I think bee gardens are beautiful gardens because they're basically just full of flowers. And really, when you guys make bee gardens, you're helping to conserve wild pollinators because over a quarter of California's bee species live in urban habitats. So by planting the right flowers, you're going to be helping to save the bees. You don't have to be a beekeeper to save the bees because we know that the beekeepers are helping honeybees, which aren't even native. So if you want to help save the bees, then plant a garden. All right, we got another question here. Yes, Quinn, save the bees. Love that. All right. Do we have any questions? Anything else that come up? You guys can like unmute yourselves if you want. Or you can send more chat questions. There's a cool website you can look at. It's called helpabee.org. And this is the Urban Bee Labs website that I built many years ago. And it's full of information. There's plant lists if you want to know specifically what plants to plant in your garden. If you want more information about the common bees, differences between bees and flies and wasps, all that kind of stuff is on that website. And then some cool books. There's the California Bees in Blooms. There's also Common Bees of California. This is by Gretchen Laboon at San Francisco State. And then the Xerces Society, which they are a nonprofit. They help insect conservation. I know this is backwards, but this is called Attracting Native Pollinators, Protecting North America's Bees and Butterflies. And this came out a few years ago, and this one's really great too. It has all kinds of gardening stuff and bee identification stuff too. So,
What was the middle book again?
the California Bees in Blooms.
Nope, the next one.
The Common
Yes.
Bees. Yeah.
Say
This
again.
one, this is a field guide to the Common Bees of California, and it's by Gretchen Laboon. It's just drawings. It does have really good drawings, but no photographs in this one. Oh, somebody already has a copy of this one. Cool, you guys. Awesome. Yeah, this, our book came out in 2014 through Heyday Press, and we're actually working on an updated one, but this one has really nice photos. At the end, it even has garden recipes. So depending on if you want an all native garden or a combination of native and non-native, or if you're a brown thumb gardener and you don't have good gardening skills, we tell you the really easy plants to grow. All right, any other questions? Let's see. What was that little flip book you showed at the beginning? Yeah, so a few years back, I designed this flip booklet, which the lab, we printed ourselves, but UCANR decided to publish like a real copy of it. So it's Common Bees in California Gardens. And I'm gonna bring a few of these to you, Letty, next week, and you can share them around, but you can go on UCANR's website or Heyday's website. I think they sell these too. And we're actually working on like a plant version of this too. So all the, how to identify the favorite bee plants in California, but this one focuses like mostly just on the bees. So there's lots of resources coming out. Let's see, and then how many bees come to a flower per day? Whew, man, I think that sounds like a project that you need to work on, Thomas. I think you should you know, park yourself on a good non-smoky day, park yourself in front of a good patch of flowers, and maybe for like an hour or half an hour you can count, and then you can extrapolate for the rest of the day. So if maybe in half an hour 10 bees come, then you can say, okay, well, you know, maybe in this many hours such and such many bees will come. So I have no idea how much that would be, but I think it is a pretty high number. So flowers can produce nectar and pollen little by little throughout the day, so that when the bees come by, they have some resources. Or in the morning, they just say, here's everything I got. And the bees come by and drain all the nectar and pollen. And then it takes them a few hours throughout the day to produce more of those resources so that other bees that come by can get some. So it kind of just depends on the flower. But you guys had some amazing questions, better than most questions from most of the adults I talked to be honest. So anything else that I can share about bees with you guys? We answer questions. All right.
This was
Well, we,
and I really, really appreciate you doing this for all of us.
of course. I hope it wasn't too long. I told you we could talk for a long time about bees.
It was so fascinating. It's all like, we have pages of notes. Like
Oh, yay. Cool. Well, now maybe you guys can plan some like science projects around bees.
Absolutely.
Maybe, George, you're gonna have to let me know if you think of some cool stuff. And if there's anything else I can share with you guys in the future, just let me know. I will send you guys a PDF of the talk, and then George, you can share the link with the recording with everybody. Awesome. Well, it was really nice to meet you guys.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's my
I'm all fired up about the bees now.
Yay! Yeah, it's a good project to be fired up about. You really are really doing a good thing, you know, like getting into bees is super fun because then you're benefiting all the other organisms that like flowers, and you really are helping to conserve like these super important pollinators. So, yay! Awesome. Well, this was super fun, and I'll see Letty and you guys at the food bank next week.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you
All
so
right,
much,
take
Jamie.
care. You're welcome. Bye, everybody.
Bye.